We are going to try to tackle 2 books in one night. Luckily, they're short. So hopefully we can do it. Other longer books we've tried to tackle in one night and probably not done so good. But hopefully these shorter ones will make some sense. Joel and Amos. We're in the minor prophets. As you know, minor not because they're unimportant, minor just because they're shorter. Called in the Hebrew Bible the Scroll of the 12, or the Book of the 12, because they were all on one scroll. It's kind of been our approach throughout this thing, is looking at what we call the Old Testament through the lens of the Jewish eyes and the Jewish order and the Jewish organization. Put the slide that shows the difference in the order, but just a reminder, they're the same books, they're the same content, not different, but just organized a little bit differently. And somewhat the reason for that we've talked about as we go along. So we're in the section, there are 3 sections in the Hebrew Bible: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. We're in the prophets section. We're in the last part of the prophets section, the so-called minor prophets here. A couple of just kind of interesting thoughts as I've been reading about the minor prophets. One thing that I've come across several times lately is the idea that this book of the 12 is, in Hebrew thought, considered a unit. It's considered, though we divide it into 12 different prophets, and it's 12 different prophets in their mind, 12 different sections over different periods of time. They see it as a unity. For instance, one of the things we'll see tonight is some themes that they put together. We'll see in Joel and Amos and in Obadiah next week. This idea of the day of the Lord. We'll talk a little bit about that. Not necessarily chronological, not even by size order, but sometimes thematic things tying together. I thought that was interesting. I don't know how much we want to go down that rabbit hole, because we want to get into the particulars of these books. So, and make sure nobody else has popped in. Nope. The book of Joel. Joel's name is fascinating in Hebrew. Sefer, which is book, and Ya'el, Yah. What's that short for? El, what's that short for? Elohim. So his name means the Lord is God. Yahweh is Elohim.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating name.
I wrote it down, but I have
There we go.
already.
Awesome.
So I was trying to answer, but I forgot.
So the Lord is God, is the meaning of his name. Again, remember when we said this lowercase or small caps indicates the word Yahweh, the covenant name of God. So this Yah at the beginning and El at the end, the two names that are prominent in the Old Testament, kind of mashed together in abbreviated form his name. Here's our wonderful chart of where these prophets sort of fit. And the first thing we're going to talk about tonight is, where does Joel fit? Joel is unique. So far, when we've looked at the other prophetic books, we've done Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, they've given us connectors to the larger history of Israel and Judah. There's nothing in Joel that connects it. He doesn't state, when we go to Amos, he'll say, Prophet Amos, when this person was king, when I think Jeroboam II was king of Israel, and I forget who's king in Judah, they have these connectors to history. Joel doesn't have one. So what we have to do, and what scholars have done, is try to decide where he fits. And how do you do that? Based on the content. Now, if you've looked at Joel, it's short. It's only 3 chapters, a very short book. So looking through it, scholars say, we need to place it somewhere, try to figure it out historically. What are we looking for? Well, several things come up. One thing is, there are no kings, like I just said, mentioned. So that can mean, on some people's minds, it's assumed who the king is. And so they actually put Joel really early, maybe in the period of Solomon, because at that point in time when he wrote, you didn't have to ask who the king was. Everybody knows who the king. Or otherwise, they move him really late to about 500 or so after the return from exile when there's no king technically in Israel. So these kind of are this is one factor. How does that work? He addresses in his book elders. Again, there seems to be leaders in Israel, but not kings. And so that's again, when would that fit? Now, on the other hand, another clue we have that helps us date it is their text in Joel. He describes a functioning temple system, a functioning sacrificial system. So again, if we're going back, we've got to have Solomon's temple in place, or that doesn't make sense. So Solomon up to here, Jeroboam the second. So that's, a little bit of wiggle room there. Or we come to about 515 after the exile, when the exiles come back and get the temple kind of up and running again. There's a temple system, so maybe he's over here. So there's some, I don't want to say confusion, because that's not the right word. There's some uncertainty about exactly where his writings happened in the course of the history of Israel. One of the things that we get to.
I have a question before. Temple and tabernacle, are they same?
Well, no. The tabernacle was that movable structure in the wilderness.
Okay.
And the temple doesn't come until Solomon. He builds the temple in Jerusalem.
Okay.
So they function the same as the place where God dwelt, but they're different things.
Tabernacle is after temple.
No, before.
Before.
Tabernacle happens in Exodus.
So tabernacle is before starting year? 200 BC?
Oh, way back. It was
way back.
With Exodus.
Okay, that's what I want to do.
Exodus ends, the book of Exodus ends with the tabernacle being built and dedicated.
Okay.
So we're way back, way back.
So I got confused. It's temple and tabernacle. Yeah.
So the temple doesn't come along until Solomon, which is somewhere in here.
Okay, thank you.
So another factor that some people, that what I've read more and more people are thinking maybe Joel is a later date. Part of the reason is because some of what he writes describes the current situation as a crisis, hinting at exile type realities. Like the exile is an understood reality, not a future threat, like, for instance, Hosea did or Amos will point to, but something that seems to be a reality that some people are still experiencing. Not everybody has returned from exile by the time we get over here. Ezra and Nehemiah, obviously that's a big part of the return, but not everybody's come back. So there's that. There seems to be that crisis. Another thing, and we'll spend a few slides on this, we won't go into great detail, is in Joel, we find echoes of other prophets. Now, you see here we've got Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Michael. So if you go back to our timeline, Isaiah, that's here. So that's close to where this time room is. Micah, where do we have Micah? He's here. But Ezekiel, we talked about him a week or two ago. Ezekiel's in the exile. So if Joel is echoing Ezekiel, and there's a couple places where there seem to be echoes, could that put him further here? Of course, then the opposite of that is maybe Ezekiel's echoing Joel, not the other way around, and so he's here. Maybe these other prophets, Isaiah, Micah, and Ezekiel, are using and expanding themes from Joel, not the other way around. We don't know. Joel doesn't have footnotes that tells us in these verses, in Joel 2:3, a footnote that says, see Ezekiel 36. And Ezekiel 36 doesn't have a footnote that says, see Joel 2:3. So we don't know. But these are ways scholars look at these things. Now, here's the best news of all. Are you ready? We could spend another 30 minutes debating all the specifics. Here's the good news. It doesn't matter. Because the message of Joel applies in either historical situation. Whether we're here or whether we're here, Joel has some things to say. The fact that it doesn't mention it, maybe we just should be content with. We're not sure where in this history of God's people, Israel, he falls, and maybe we should just concern ourselves with what he says. But since we've kind of been looking at this in a little bit of kind of a more academic way and a less devotional way as we've gone, I thought that would be something that would be interesting, at least it is to me. And since I put together the lesson, you have to listen to it. So there you go. So a little fun with that. Let's move on. An overview and outline of Joel. Again, it's a short book, only 3 chapters. Starts out in chapter 1, indicating there's something happening. There's a crisis the people are experiencing. And this crisis becomes both the reality that they're experiencing and sort of a predictor of what will be the coming crisis, that he uses some of the imagery in the ideas of chapter 1 and that crisis to talk about there's another coming crisis that's much bigger. And then at the end, most of the 3rd chapter, the last few verses of chapter 2, he points to this idea of the coming day of the Lord, or as I like to call it, the great and terrible day of the Lord. It's great or it's terrible, depending on which side of Jesus you're on. That's how it works. But this is kind of there. We'll actually look at a verse, I forget which one it is, that uses that phrase, great and terrible day of the Lord. So there's the kind of the overview. What is the current crisis? Well, Joel starts out by talking about some locusts. Fascinating. He says in verse 4, what the locust swarm has left, the great locusts have eaten. What the great locusts have left, the young locusts have eaten. What the young locusts have left, other locusts have eaten. How's that? Locusts are hungry, if nothing else. This is the thing that he points to, something that happened or is happening, or the people would be aware of, that they would have in their mind. Now, I've seen pictures, and maybe you've studied. We talked about this a while back, this idea of what locusts do. They're pretty devastating. And the imagery here in verse 4 is a lot. Many scholars think it has to do with the stages of development of locusts. Because obviously they swarm in. One of the first things they do is lay eggs. They lay eggs and they dig holes, several inches deep and a little bit round. They lay about 100 eggs at a time, and they're in a perfect cone. It's really weird and really creepy to see. It's kind of like something happening here. And if there are enough of them that come in, just the digging of the hole and whatever the vegetation that they destroy just to lay their eggs is awful. Well, after a period of time, the eggs hatch and you've got the young, whatever phase locusts you want, that get out and they're hungry. We have, well, I know some of you know this because we talked about it before, some, what are they called for monarch butterflies? Milkweed, that's what they are. Milkweed plants. We've had them for several years. But I think it was 2017 when we first did them. And around Thanksgiving, we had over 100 chrysalises around our house. But here's the thing. When they find that milkweed and the queen begins to lay the eggs, it doesn't last long. You watch those caterpillars and they just eat, and before you know it, it's stripped bare. And that's just a few monarch caterpillars. We're not talking locusts. And that's the picture that Joel's painting. They come out of their eggs and they begin to eat. What does he say? The locust swarm that's come has eaten, and they've left behind their young, and now they come out and they begin to eat. And as the young grow, they shed their first level of skin, and they're able to hop a little bit. They're not, larval worms. And then they can jump, and then they go a little bit higher. They can get to a little more of the plant. And as they grow from there, they eventually get their wings, and they get to be that 3 or 4 inch armored cricket thing that just tears everything up. And that's the picture that he uses here, this progressive sense of destruction and the helplessness that the people feel in it. And he says, this is the crisis you're experiencing, but this crisis is only a taste of what's to come. And in chapter 2, he uses some of this same imagery to say, for instance, where does he go? Verses 3, before them fire devours, behind them a flame blazes. Before them the land is like the Garden of Eden. Behind them a desert waste. Nothing escapes them. They have the appearance of horses. They gallop along like cavalry. So we've gone from locust to an invading army that's pictured here. Not just a natural reality, but this judgment from God. With the noise like that of chariots, they leap over the mountains, like crackling fire, consuming stubble, like a mighty army drawn up for battle. And on he goes to describe that this current crisis is difficult, is bad, but it's nothing compared to what's coming because of the realities that Israel is facing. I don't remember what's next. Okay, here we go. So what are we supposed to do? In light of the crisis we see that warns of a greater coming crisis, even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. And in this line, rend your heart and not your garments. What we see as a theme a lot of times in the prophets, by the way, this is 2:12 and 13, if you're keeping score at home, is even though Israel is far from God in their heart, they're very active in their religious duty. They're very pious in keeping the festivals and the sacrificial system going. And God says to them, this coming calamity, the way to have it not result in this calamity isn't to go about rending your garments. This would be a sign of kind of sackcloth and ashes and mourning and sorrow over the reality that is external. God says, I need the rending to be of your heart. It needs to be an internal reality. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, and he relents from sending calamity. Where have we heard that before? Exodus 34, when God appears to Moses, right? What does he say? I'm so glad you asked. Verse 6, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Some of these same words from God's revelation of himself, Joel picks up and says, if we will take God seriously and rend our heart and not our garments, then he will relent, because out of his character, out of his compassion, out of his love for us, he will not send the calamity. Again, this is a good kind of next step from Hosea. What's Hosea about? We have a very powerful illustration of the love of God, don't we? God says, here's how much I love my people Israel. I'm going to ask the prophet to marry an unfaithful wife that will have children out of that unfaithfulness, and she will abandon him and pursue prostitution, and he will have to redeem her. He will have to buy her back from slavery. That was last week, as a demonstration of his love that's a picture of God's love for his people. And so on the heels of that, even though we have this kind of cataclysmic imagery of locusts and armies marching, the message of Hosea informs how we read Joel, that the God who is abounding in love is still the same. The issue isn't a change in God. It's kind of a change in us, right? Yeah, absolutely it is. God still loves. We have turned from him. And the picture, by the way, of that chapter 1, verse 4, that sort of increasingly devastating process of the locust could also be used as the reality of that's how sin works in our lives, that pulls us away from God. It's not just the devastation of the agriculture, it's the devastation of our lives. When that first bit of sin comes in and left unchecked, it gets a little bigger, and left unchecked, it gets a little bigger, and left unchecked, it gets a little bigger, until it's all consuming. And we find ourselves way far from where we want to be. As the old sermon goes, sin will take you further than you're willing to go. cost you more than you're willing to pay and keep you longer than you're willing to stay. I don't know, you gotta love those old preachers that came up with those alliterative or rhyming outlines. The reality of sin. And here's the thing that I would also suggest. A lot of times we get into these prophets and we hear this judgmental language, this calamity that's coming. And we can see the temptation for a lot of people, and maybe even sometimes us, is to read this and say, gosh, God is just mad. He's just angry all the time. He just wants to get you for that. There was a song, right? God's going to get you for that. You remember that one? You do. That was a real song, by the way, I promise. Kind of a thing there. And people have this view of God. But I think the message that we want to see in these prophets, and the reason I think Hosea is a great introduction to some of the rest of these minor prophets with language like the harshness we've seen already, is that God's love is the one that's abounding and incredibly generous to us. The reality of the destruction that comes isn't because God's somehow vengeful and trying to get it. It's because at times God allows us to go down that road that we're going down. A lot of people say, this is a little off the subject of maybe Joel, but I've had the conversation a few times. People would ask, how could a loving God send anyone to a place like hell? Like if he was really loving, he wouldn't do that. Okay, that seems like a pretty convincing, what do you do with that? Well, my thought is, God, yes, is abounding in love, but also in creating us with free will, respects that free will. And let's take a biological example, for instance. If you have, I'll just say cancer, because that's what comes to mind, don't know why. You have cancer, and it's left untreated for a period of 5 years, or 10 years, or 20 years, what's going to begin to happen? If you're lucky, right, depending on what kind it is, you might not even get that long. What happens if you take that same sort of disease and extend it out 1,000 years? What level of damage, destruction could that do? Is that so? If sin is like that, the issue isn't God is vengeful. He just allows us to pursue that which we say we want instead of or more than him. And the result in eternity looks an awful lot uglier than we ever imagined in the short period of our life, or in the moment where that temptation seemed like, oh, I just need this. And so the message of the prophets begins with Hosea, this abounding love. The message of Exodus, when God reveals himself, is this abounding love, gracious, compassionate, slow to anger. And that informs the rest of it for us. Let's go on. Oh, told you I wasn't going to get to 2 books tonight. Okay, I promise I will. Here we go. And afterwards, where are we? Let's just find this. Joel 2:28. So this is the moving into the hopeful section of Joel. After the current crisis and the coming crisis, we take that last part that points to the day of the Lord, verse 28 of chapter 2. And afterwards, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days. I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood, fire, and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness, the moon to blood before the great and dreadful. There it is, or terrible, I said earlier. Great and dreadful day of the Lord. And then the next verse. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. The great and dreadful day of the Lord, the sun turned to darkness, the moon to blood. That sounds bad. But everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord is saved. Yes, ma'am.
King James says, before coming to the great and awesome day of the Lord.
Great and awesome day of the Lord. Awesome, we think of in our vernacular as cool, rad, wow. Awesome can also be terrifying.
Yes.
Something truly, The eruption of a volcano is awesome, unless you're standing on the lip of the volcano's cone, then it's terrifying, right? Perspective is everything between awesome and terrifying. By the way, does this sound familiar to anybody? These verses? The pouring out my spirit, sons and daughters prophesying. What's that?
Paul used some of those same phrases.
Well, Paul definitely used this one in Romans 10, but this whole passage is quoted in a New Testament book. We've been studying it for since what?
Matthew.
Last year,
Matthew?
the day of Pentecost. Acts chapter 2. Peter gets up. And what happens? They have received the Spirit, tongues, the wind, the tongues like flames of fire. They go out. The miracle of tongues is happening. And the people that are seeing that said, it's only 9 o'clock in the morning and they're stone cold drunk. And Peter gets up and says, no. These men are not drunk as you suppose. But what you're seeing, I like the translation. I don't know which one of these is. This is that. And he quotes this exact passage about the pouring out of his spirit, sons and daughters prophesying. Acts chapter 2. Did I not put that in?
17 and 18.
Thank you. Whoever found that.
2:17 and 18.
2:17 and 18. There you go. And he goes all the way down to this. Everyone who called, I marked it. I knew I had it somewhere. There it is. 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21. This whole thing he quotes, which is pretty remarkable. The day of Pentecost, Peter says, this began to take place. This began to happen. The Old Testament idea of pouring out the Spirit of God was narrow. We see it in the prophets at times where they speak through the Spirit. We see it elsewhere in the Judges, particularly. Samson, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he had the ability to do some amazing things. One of the saddest verse, he did not know that the Lord had left him that last time after the whole Delilah incident. The Spirit of God was given in sort of short doses for particular reasons in the Old Testament. And Joel says, one day, I'm going to just pour out my Spirit on everybody. It's going to be an unmistakable. It's not going to be a limited time. It's not going to be short. It's going to be amazing. And Peter says in Acts chapter 2, hey, what you're seeing today, people gathered for Pentecost, the thousands and maybe tens of thousands of pilgrims, this is that. God is keeping his promises and ultimately ends within everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And then he preaches that sermon. And what's the sermon about? It's about who Jesus is and what happened to him. God has made this Jesus whom you crucified both Lord and Christ. And they were cut to the heart and said, what shall we do? Repent and be baptized. And 3,000 are added to their number that day. Oh, I guess we're going to Amos. Okay, 6:30. That's a good time to go to Amos because Amos is longer. That's my quick rush. There's only 3 chapters. As we've seen already in the prophets, there's harsh language, but there's always the note of hope. What's the end of? I love the end of the book of Joel. It almost echoes Ezekiel. Remember Ezekiel, the last vision Ezekiel has of the city with the river that begins to flow, and it's just a trickle, and then it gets a little deeper, and it gets a little deeper, and it's knee deep, and it's waist deep until it becomes this wide river that flows into the Dead Sea. And when it flows into the Dead Sea, this sea that can support no life just becomes the most lush Garden of Eden-esque place. And the end of Ezekiel, we find out the name of that city is the Lord is there, right? That's what Ezekiel says, the name of that city that all this happens as well. At the end of Joel, we see echoes in verse 18. In that day, the mountains will drip new wine. The hills will flow with milk. The ravines of Judah will run with water. A fountain will flow out of the Lord's house and will water the valley. The Ezekiel vision is the temple is where the water starts. And the last verse, The Lord dwells in Zion. The Lord is there, is the name of that city in Ezekiel. So here we have, these are very parallel images. Which one informed which? If you think Joel is early, Joel informs Ezekiel. If you think Joel is later, Ezekiel forms Joel. But maybe it's just that God has a consistent message through his prophets that he wants to get out to his people. And that the bottom line is, where is heaven? Wherever God is. Call it what you want. The Lord is there. That's the definition. All right, any thoughts about Joel before we move forward to Amos? That's just my excuse to catch my breath.
Just reading the Bible makes me thinking, there's a invasion of a carcass.
Locust?
Yeah. That to me sound we are going through right now the pandemic and kills all the people in the Bible too. And same way, those kind of things happening to us this day. And all the things that are happening around the world appears to be in this Bible a lot of ways. Don't you see that if you read it?
And even if it's not one for one an exact connection, at the very least, it gives us the message underneath the difficulty we face of how we should handle it. And the presence of God and the Spirit of God and the hope of God and the love of God and the grace of God in spite of the difficulty. I couldn't think of it. Yeah, I had to have it. My mind went in that way too. Sure. See the how God is, working on us. And it's a recycling type thing. Well, we've said that. The view of the Hebrews of history isn't linear; it's cyclic, and we've seen it over and over again in these cycles. That they don't. It's not reincarnation. It's not that. But humanity seems to move in these cycles toward and away from God, and God responds. Tillman, you were going to say something.
I've been watching this show on TV about the Valley of Jehovah. And that's what the wine press is going to be.
Okay.
And the blood's going to run for 200 miles.
Ouch. I think the Valley of Jehoshaphat shows up in Amos. What's that?
Yes, in Amos. When we were there, we were right there.
Near Jezreel, right?
Yes.
Near Armageddon.
Well,
Har Megiddo.
the
Tell
Mount of
Megiddo.
Olives up
Right.
here, and it goes down. Remember how steep it
Oh, yeah.
was? And then you go and you start back up to the Temple Mount. That valley was
Okay.
the Valley of Jehoshaphat,
Okay.
200 miles long. It starts
It's going to run into the Dead Sea,
and
turn
it
the
starts
Dead
up
Sea
north.
fresh,
It
all the
goes
way
around south.
to the Red Sea.
That's a long way.
It's a long.
Yes. That is fascinating. Well, again, Amos, that's where the Valley of Jehoshaphat shows up, like you said a minute ago. Speaking of Amos, that's my next slide, right? Here's Amos in Hebrew, Amos, carried by God. We don't really have the traditional Yah or El, so this name is maybe kind of a thing. We get right off the bat in that translation that I'm using. I'm not sure if that's the best, but that's one that said that's his name is his name. Nonetheless, here we go. Verse 1 and 2 tells us Uzziah was king of Judah, Jeroboam was king of Israel. If you remember, we said last week, this is the same period of time as Hosea. Jeroboam II in Israel is the golden age of Israel. This is when things are going well. They have retaken, just a quick review, territory that they had lost. They've even taken Damascus in Syria, which is pretty remarkable. Their economy is roaring. Everything in Israel looks great. But as we said last week, the verdict of Jeroboam II is that he followed in the footsteps of his father Jeroboam, the first king of Israel, and did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so the conflict that we'll see in Amos is the people say, man, everything is great. God is blessing us. We talked about this a little bit last week in Hosea. But the prophet says, not so fast. Things aren't what they look like at the surface. Here's that same chart again. We've got Amos, Jeroboam II, Uzziah here. Hosea lasted through several kings. Amos is a little more narrow in his ministry. Amos, by the way, not a traditional call, like he's called to be a prophet. We might say he's not a professional. He introduces himself. He's a shepherd of Tekoa. He's a regular guy. He's a southern kingdom resident, Judah, that takes a trip up to the northern kingdom, particularly to the city of Bethel, where when the northern kingdom split off from the southern kingdom, you remember they made 2 shrines, one at Bethel on the south, which is closer to Jerusalem, one at Dan in the north, and installed in these shrines to get started the right way, golden calves, as if, the whole Egypt thing wasn't bad enough. So this is Israel. Jeroboam I, Jeroboam II has done nothing about these shrines. They're still going strong. Amos comes on the scene. Oh, by the way, here's your treat. I think it's famous, Amos. I only did 10. Anybody want to buy it? Do I have enough? I didn't count. Uh-oh. Miss Pat, you get the whole bag. You got it. So that was my visual aid. It has nothing to do with it. But he's a regular guy. He's a shepherd. He doesn't give his bona fides. We don't hear like we did with Isaiah or Jeremiah, this call. And yet here he's going to take this message to the northern kingdom, even though he's from the southern kingdom, about God and his judgment. Basic outline starts out most of chapter 1 after he introduces himself through the beginning of chapter 3. Oracles against the nations happen. And then early in chapter 2, he switches things up and begins to have oracles against the people of Israel. After all of these oracles, he gets these visions of judgment. There's 5 or 6 pictures we'll talk about in a few minutes that God gives him of judgment. And as always, the last few verses, what do we have? A little hope, a little promise of restoration. Amos starts this way. If you read all of these places, you have a very similar saying. This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of fill in the blank, even for 4. And if you look at verse 3, it's for 3 sins of Damascus. That's Syria, right? We looked at that.
Right.
Verse 6, for 3 sins of Gaza. That's down south toward Egypt. We can keep going. For 3 sins of Tyre. That's on the coast, Tyre and Sidon. For 3 sins of Edom. That's on the other side of the Jordan River. For 3 sins of Ammon. That's another of the across the river kind of people. For 3 sins of Moab. Again, that's on the eastern side. And then verse 4. I mean, I can picture. Amos comes up. He goes to this temple in Bethel. He's preaching this message. And I bet up to chapter 2, verse 3, the people have been amening like crazy. Amen. Let's talk about the sins of Samaria and Damascus. Or Syria and Damascus. Let's talk about the sins of Gaza, of Ammon, of Moab. And then in verse 4, for 3 sins of who? Judah. Well, that's a little close to home. That's his hometown, right? So maybe Israel's like, uh-oh. Maybe they're okay with that still, right? For 3 sins of Judah, okay, they're the neighbor to the south. Then verse 6, for 3 sins of Israel. Amos done gone to meddling now. He was doing fine until he started turning ever closer to the people he was talking to. And so beginning in that section for 3 sins of Israel, but all the way through back to the outline, the end of chapter 6, there is this diatribe that goes against the people of Israel. I mean, he sets them up. You want to look at kind of sermonic homiletics thing. He kind of rakes them in. He invites them into this moment, and they're all thrilled with God's judgment until, now it's us he's talking about, and we don't want any part of that. And so he gets them just that way. What's that?
The screen is moving around.
Must have been pushing. Where are we? Okay, there we go. I think I was holding this wrong. I'll put it down. So what are some of the things that Amos goes after the people of Israel for? You would certainly expect their idolatry, but one charge that, and this maybe is a lot of the thing Amos is known for, one charge that seems to come up over and over again is charges of injustice. Chapter 2, as he goes after Israel, verse 6, they sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Silver would be sort of a picture of debt. They set what happens if you can't pay your debt in the Old Testament days. You became a servant to the person who you owed until hopefully the year of Jubilee and the Sabbath year lets you be free. By the way, interestingly enough, talking to people, there's not a lot of record that ever happened, or it happened very often in Israel. That promise of Jubilee was not often observed in a formal way in the people's lives. So the picture here is of the poor person who goes into slavery, and not only that, what's the need? A pair of sandals. They can't even. This is how bankrupt the poor are. They can't even afford the shoes to put on their feet. Verse 7, they trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground. They deny justice to the oppressed. Father and son use the same girl. So sexual immorality there as well. And so profane my holy name. They lie down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. There's again, they've exploited someone by taking a garment for a wage, and they use it as the bed on which they commit their sexual immorality. Where? Right by the altar. Now, for Israel, this is not something they're listening to very well, because things are going great. The army has taken back territory. We're prosperous. And Amos is just blasting them time and again. This is what the reality of their lives. And so the theme of injustice is built quite a bit in Amos. One of my favorite places is chapter 4, verse 1. Amos might have gone too far here. He says, hear the word, you cows of Bashan on Mount Samaria, you women who oppress the poor, and called the ladies the cows of Bashan. Now, I don't know if it meant the same insult we would say today, but it probably wasn't meant to be flattering in any way. You women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and say to your husbands, bring us some drinks. So we've got this total apathy toward the poor and the needy, and they're being abused and used by the wealthy. They're being exploited by the wealthy. Now, many moons ago in Leviticus, I don't know if we've spent a lot of time on this, but there's a lot that's said in the law about how you treat and the provisions that are made for those who are poor. Things like when you glean your fields, what do? If you drop something, you leave it. And you don't go all the way to the very edge. You leave the edges so that the poor can come in. There's talk about widows and orphans and the stranger and the alien and the foreigner. These categories of people that Israel was specifically supposed to treat. In fact, the alien and the foreigner, you once were aliens in a strange land, so remember that when they come to your land and treat them well. That's not a chapter and verse. That's just a general idea that's reinforced throughout the Levitical law. And so what we have by the time of Amos and the prosperity of Israel, the northern kingdom, this isn't happening. I've already mentioned that Jubilee year, which was meant so that people's land, the kind of the land rights that families had when the land was divided would never pass away from that family. That was kind of your security in the land. That's been abused and ignored. And so on and on, these accusations go against the people of Israel. And the issue is justice. But here's the irony. Even though they're doing these things, they're also still very devout. For instance, chapter 4, right after this cows of Bashan kind of slam, verse 4, go to Bethel and sin. Go to Gilgal and sin yet more. How are they doing that? Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 years. Burn leavened bread as a thank offering. Brag about your freewill offerings. Boast about them, you Israelites, for this is what you love to do. So they were doing the religious thing. They were making the sacrifices. They were making the offerings. Chapter 5, verses 21, 22, and 23, similar idea. I hate, God says through Amos, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. How's that? I mean, could you imagine God saying, listen, I came to your church and it stunk. I mean, this is what he's saying. It was bad. It's not good. I despise it. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, but the things the law tells them to do, they're not making stuff up. They're doing what they're told to do in the law. But even though you bring me those things, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice offering, fellowship offering, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your song. I guess they didn't have any good singers in Israel either. I will not listen to the music of your harps. I'm sorry, what was that?
Didn't like to know it.
Didn't, I guess not. So we've got this people that are doing the religious thing, that are keeping the commandments that they're told about doing these things. But God says, what you're doing externally is meaningless, because internally and your treatment of other people goes against the bulk of the law. By the way, Jesus says, I think to the Pharisees, you tithe of your mint, your spice, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law. Why? Because that was easy. You can do that. You know, the women are saying, we got plenty. Take the bread. Bring me something to drink. It's okay. We got plenty. God's like, no, you've missed the point entirely. And so Amos comes into Israel where everything is hunky-dory, everything is great, and makes these accusations about the, we might say, the performative nature of their religious faith without the heart of God or for God behind it. And so this is the accusation. And so he does this and he comes at them in the next section. Chapter 7 through the first part of 9, there's a lot that goes on in here. He gives these pictures of what judgment. Well, you can see they're very brief. They're not long pictures. Chapter 7, we got locusts again. He was preparing swarms of locusts. So the picture is God's judgment is going to be as devastating as a locust storm. Verses 4 through 6. The sovereign Lord was calling for judgment by fire, which would make sense. It's a few verses later. God has a plumb line. It says verse 7 or verse 8, I'm setting a plumb line among my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. You know, a plumb line, very basic tool, right? You put a weight on a string and you can see if something's plumb or level or straight or whatever. You know, now we have laser stuff. No, we don't need it. Very effective. God says, I held my plumb line up and you're crooked. And so I can't hold back my wrath anymore. Chapter 8, the basket of fruit. It says the basket of summer fruit or ripe fruit, depending. The idea is it's overripe. It looks good on the outside. Have you ever done that? Have you ever got a piece of fruit that looked perfect and then you bite into it and it's nasty? Or worse yet, there's like a worm in your apple and that's the bite you took. Yeah, it's gross. This is the picture. It looks good. You're doing all the things externally, but the heart. By the way, doesn't Jesus say something about the Pharisees, right? You're like whitewashed tombs, look great on the outside, you clean up nice, but on the inside you're full of dead men's bones. And then chapter 9, beginning of it, says, I saw the Lord standing by the altar. Strike the tops of the pillars so that the thresholds shake. Bring them down on the heads of all the people. We got the Samson imagery, right? Like God's going to bring the house down to judge his people. Though they hide themselves on the top of Carmel, there I will hunt them down and seize them. Verse 4, though they are driven into exile by their enemies, there I will command the sword to slay them. God, through Amos, speaks these harsh words to the people of Israel. How do they take it? Well, I think this is interesting. Back to chapter 7, we've got, beginning these images of some things. Well, there's a prophet in the king's household. His name is Amaziah. And he hears this southerner come up to Bethel proclaiming this nonsense, and he comes after him. Chapter 7, verse 10. He's the priest of Bethel. So the priest that's presiding over the temple with the golden calf in it thinks he speaks for God, and the king is listening to him. I mean, you would think, wait a minute, priest, golden calf. I've seen this somewhere. I saw that movie. It didn't end well. But this is who the king was siding with. And the priest says, Amos is raising a conspiracy theory against you in the very heart of Israel. So he wants Amos shut up. He tells him, go back home. Get out, you seer. Go back to the land of Judah. Earn your bread there. Do your prophesying there. Don't prophesy anymore at Bethel, because this is the king's sanctuary and the temple of the kingdom, and we're doing just fine. By the way, wasn't that something that happened to Jeremiah? Chapter 28, right? Jeremiah's prophesying, and Hananiah. Jeremiah's got the yoke on at that point. This yoke of wood, and Hananiah is the official kind of court prophet. He says, no, we're going to be fine. Jeremiah is saying Babylon's coming, it's going to end poorly. Hananiah says, nope, we're going to beat Babylon. And he takes the yoke and breaks it off Jeremiah's neck. And what does Jeremiah say? Oh, you might have broken the yoke of wood, but God's going to place a yoke of steel upon your necks. So we have this pushback, as it were, against the prophet of God, Amos in this case, and the people are siding, the people that are worshiping at the temple of the golden calf are siding with the prophet who leads the worship at the golden calf, where they bring all of those sacrifices we've already read about, and where they do the things that God says, I can't stand it. Amos chapter 5, verse 8, woe to you who long for the day of the Lord. There's this picture for some in Israel that the day of the Lord is the day of vindication for his people. And so they waited for it, particularly as they were dealing with these exterior threats like Assyria, Babylon, and so on. Why do you long for the day of the Lord? Amos says, that day will be darkness and not light. The day of the Lord that Amos predicts will be judgment for those who have not called upon the name of the Lord, as Joel said, and be saved. Why? Because here's probably the most famous verse from Amos, I would think. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. By the way, doesn't that sound like the river that leaves the temple in Ezekiel, that Amos at the end of his book kind of hints at? That this river of God's justice just keeps on rolling. Verse 8, or chapter 8, verse 11, the days are coming, declares the Lord, the sovereign Lord, when I will send a famine through the land. So famine, locusts, those are bad things, right? But Amos is clear. This famine is not of food or of thirst for water, but a much worse famine, a famine of hearing the words of the Lord. They're not going to listen to God anymore. They've decided they're fine. They don't need this southern hick shepherd prophet all up in their business. They just want him to go home. They got it under control. God has blessed them. Their boundaries have grown. Everything is going fine. And Amos says, no, that's the problem. The problem isn't you're not hungry and you're not thirsty. The problem is you're not hearing from God. When you don't hear from God, we don't follow the words of God, well, you're in trouble. I had a video, but we don't have time. It's like 8 minutes long. So sorry. Yes, ma'am.
It seems like, people will say God is a loving God or whatever, but he's a righteous God as well. And so he gave us his law. He gave us the commandments in the Old Testament for these people, the Jewish people, and he also declared things like the Jubilee and things like that. If they only pick what parts of the law they like only offering, I've got the best cattle. I'm going to offer and I'm going to tell you how great it was, and the Lord's going to really bless me because I had this big bowl. So they're going to be bragging because of they've taken something that God told them to do and made it something for themselves. And so they lost, like you said, the sight of the Lord. And they don't love the Lord's word anymore. They don't hear his word because they don't see it, because they're satisfied with where they are. But long story short, if you love the Lord with your whole heart, spirit, soul, body, whatever.
I think that's a command somewhere.
Yes, you would follow what he says. And then things he wouldn't need to come down with, plagues and, people coming, from Syria, take you away, or Babylon. He wouldn't need to do that if you could follow, So it's so important to stay in the word. So we know who God is, what he's after. We know his heart. We know what he's doing, and we can listen and follow. And then we can avoid a lot of the issues that would come from calamities of sin and not listening.
And if you remember, those of you who've kind of been around for a while, when we started this prophetic section, we said, in the Hebrew mind, what's a prophet? It's not a predictive role. It's a role that calls people to faithfulness to the covenant that God has revealed. That's what Amos is doing. That's what Joel is doing. That's what everybody we've talked about in this prophetic section is doing. Saying, yeah, there are these, the days are coming. That sounds predictive, but they're not making this stuff up, because remember Deuteronomy 28, here are the blessings and here are the curses if you don't keep the covenant. They're just reminding the people of what God already told them. They're not coming up with new stuff. They're just calling them to faithfulness to what's already been revealed in the law. They're commentators on the culture of the people, and they've seen that they are wanting. So at times it feels like, again, a harsh message from like Amos or Joel. But again, read the last few verses of Amos, and you'll see the days are coming, declares, or verse 11 of chapter 9. In that day, I will restore David's fallen shelter. I will repair its broken walls, restore its ruins, will build it as it used to be, so that they may possess the remnant of Eden and all the nations that bear my name. The days are coming. There's the same phrase, right? From that section in 8, now in 9. When the reaper will be overtaken by the plowman and the planter by one treading grapes. New wine will drip from the mountains and flow from all the hills. I will bring back my people Israel from exile. They will rebuild the ruined cities and live in them. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine. They will make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land I have given them, says the Lord your God. Always the note of hope that these prophets bring. God isn't vengeful and wrathful just for the sake of he's had a bad day and woke up on the wrong side of the bed. He's calling them to faithfulness to what he's revealed. And when they're faithful, his blessings will follow. That was the role of these prophets. Next week, Obadiah, the shortest, and Jonah. Obadiah is the shortest of the minor prophet book lengthwise, and Jonah has the shortest prophetic message of all the prophets. I think it's less than a sentence. 30 days and Nineveh will be destroyed. That's the prophetic message of Jonah in a nutshell. But his story is very fascinating. You might want to read those. The whale of a tale. Very true. That's a good one. I think I used a similar ID on Sunday. And I was called out for my bad dad joke. All right. Well, thanks everybody for sticking around.